looking at the stages of attachment. So the research by Schaffer and Emerson. So by the end, you should be able to describe their research, which includes their procedure and findings. And then you should be able to describe the 4 stages of attachment. So let's firstly start with the aims of their research. So Schaffer and Emerson wanted to assess whether there was a pattern of attachment formation that was common to all infants. Did all infants attach to the same person? When did this happen? And where did they go from there? How did they then go on to form attachments with others? So they wanted to identify and describe the distinct stages by which attachments form. How did they do this? They studied 60 newborn babies and their mothers. They involved skilled working class families from Glasgow, and this is going to be important when we come to evaluating this research. This study was a longitudinal study, which means that it took place over a number of months. So it took place altogether over 18 months. The babies and their mothers were studied in their homes each month for the first year of life. So they were visited every month, once a month for 12 months, and then again at 18 months. They conducted observations as well as interviews. Some of the interview questions were, who does the baby smile at? Who does the baby respond to? What causes and who causes the baby distress, for example? And these were asked to the mother. Again, we'll need to consider that when we look at evaluating the quality of this research. In terms of the observations were observing attachment behaviour in 2 particular ways. They were looking at separation anxiety and stranger anxiety. For separation anxiety, they were looking at what happened when the baby was left in a room alone, what happened when the baby was left in the room with other people, other than their attachment figure. And if they showed signs of separation anxiety, any signs of distress or crying, this would indicate that the baby had at that point formed an attachment to their caregiver. In order to test stranger anxiety, they would approach the baby at the beginning of each session. So every time they visited the infant, they would approach the infant to see if this caused them any distress. And if it did, this would indicate that the baby can recognise familiar people and feels anxious around those who are unfamiliar, indicating that attachment, or at least pre-attachment, was occurring. So, what did they find? The key finding was that attachment behaviour develops in stages loosely linked to age, i.e., there are stages of attachment formation that are common to all infants. So let's have a look at those stages now. The first stage is the asocial stage, also called pre-attachment, and this occurs from birth to 6 weeks. When infants are in this stage, they produce similar responses to people and inanimate objects. They start to show preferences to be with humans and familiar people, but generally they're just as happy in the company of a toy or an inanimate object as they are with people. After this, between 6 weeks to 7 months, we move into the indiscriminate attachment stage. This is where babies become more sociable. They start showing a preference now for humans over inanimate objects, and they start to tell people apart. They don't yet show stranger anxiety, no fear of strangers, and anybody can pick them up and comfort them. So you'll know if you've ever visited a newborn baby that they're quite happy being passed around and handled by anybody. They're not at this stage showing any separation or stranger anxiety, though they are starting to show a preference for humans, but yet no anxiety. From 7 months onwards, for 7 months to sort of 10 months, we start moving into the specific or sometimes discriminate attachment stage. This is where attachment has formed. So a baby now becomes attached to the primary attachment figure, and they start to show separation and stranger anxiety. This is when they get distressed when approached by the researcher, and this is when they are anxious and distressed when left in a room alone. After this, so from 10 to 11 months, we move into the multiple attachments stage, and this is when secondary attachments occur. This is when the infant then begins to form attachments to others other than their primary attachment figure. So grandparents, siblings, the other parent, this is when that happens. And these attachments are of a similar quality to the specific attachment that they formed in the discriminate attachment stage. So that is the main finding from Schaffer and Emerson's research. Other findings which are important, particularly later on, all of these are going to be relevant later in the attachment topic. was that primary attachments were to the person who offered the most opportunity for interaction and responded to the baby's signals with the most skill. This is called sensitive responsiveness, and this is the key indicator of a successful attachment. So if we think back to our caregiver-infant interactions, like reciprocity and interactional synchrony, it was the person who provided the most opportunities for these interactions whom the baby attached to. And so these caregiver-infant interactions seem to be key for determining the quality of an infant's attachment. And we call this sensitive responsiveness, being able to pick up on those active phases where a baby wants to engage in interaction and being able to respond to this. 65% of first attachments were to the mother. That's an interesting statistic to memorise. 3% of first attachments were to the father. 39% of attachments were not to the person who fed the infant. These are all really, really important. We're going to be looking at Bowlby's theory of monotropy. We're going to be looking at research into the role of the father. And we're also going to be looking at learning theory of attachment, which states that we attach to the person who feeds us. So these statistics are all really important for you to commit to memory so that we can use them again later on. What's also really interesting is that most infants went on to develop multiple attachments. By 18 months, 87% had at least 2 attachments, 31% had 5 or more attachments. And so we don't just form an attachment to one person, we form an attachment to many people, and that includes the father. So, what did Schaffer and Emerson conclude? They concluded that there is a pattern of attachment formation which is common to all infants. And if we're seeing something that is so universal, then it suggests that this attachment process is somewhat biologically controlled rather than learned. We could see and we can conclude from their findings that attachments are made more easily with caregivers who display sensitive responsiveness, who can recognise and respond appropriately to the infant's signals and their desire to engage in caregiver-infant interactions. And what was not important was who fed or spent the most time with the children. We can also conclude that multiple attachments are the norm, and that infants form multiple attachments by 18 months to many, many people, to siblings, to fathers, to grandparents, and these attachments are of equal quality to the first attachments they formed, which are usually to the mother.